Hello, I have thoughts. Who would have thought? Hi, hello, how's it going? It's Lo. This is a very short impromptu video because I just had a very crazy idea to do something that I thought was going to be cool to do, and I'm doing it impulsively. So I'm trusting all of you to hold me accountable. The other day, I bought a very interesting book that I wanted to buy for a very long time. Yeah, surprising no one, I bought BABEL. I am currently obsessed with this book, but I'm trying to pace myself in reading it. I have this thing when I'm eating where my boyfriend is like, please slow down, you're gonna choke yourself. And then I always end up choking because I eat too fast and I never chew properly. I'm talking about food, you nasty motherfuckers. Anyway, I bought BABEL. And what I want is to make sure that I am pacing myself while reading this book because there's just so much that can be analyzed and so many themes. Like I've just been making extensive notes on this book. And so what I want to do is a read along. I want to read this book in installments. So I just read the first book. If you've gotten BABEL, you know that it has 5 inner books, which I marked, like I tabbed each one. And I want to come here and discuss each one and my impressions of it as I go along. So yeah, this is a new thing that I'm doing. If it works, I'm going to do it with other books that I think have other things to talk about. And I want to do this. So yeah, BABEL read along. Read along with me. I am going to start this video already in the first book because I've already finished it. So I'm just going to talk about my impressions. This is not going to be spoiler free, but I would like not to be spoiled. So if you've read the book and any of the questions that I have in the book, you're like, I know the answer for that, keep it to yourself. I don't want to know it, okay? I am interested in finding along, and I just want to see, you know, people who might want a little bit of help buddy reading this. It's almost like you're buddy reading this, but you don't have my DMs. We're just buddy reading it with a book, okay? Buddy read with Lo. Let's call it like that. And so if you're interested in having someone to go along that might have a little bit more of context about the things that are being said in what it comes to academia, then this is an opportunity for you. You might realize that my face looks a lot whiter than what it usually should. The weather looks like shit. So also I changed foundations. I hate it. I can never like, either the foundation is too white or it's too yellow or it's too dark, it's too warm, it's just too everything. I could never find something that matches me well. So this is what we're working with, okay? We're not gonna comment on it. Also, by the way, if you're my patron, there will also be Patreon exclusive content of this book where I dunk on racist reviews of BABEL. It's going to be super fun once I'm done. And so, yeah, if you want to see that, you can check the link for my Patreon in the description below. Also, if you are one of my patrons on the Grávidas of Taubaté tier or above, you'll also get a full list of references, and some tiers also have access to the full references digitally made available for you guys. So you can all check out that if you want to as well, so you can have a deeper experience. But yeah, we're just gonna start with the first book of BABEL. I did a lot of heavy annotating and there's a lot of themes that I want to discuss, but for this video I want to discuss 4 themes. I want to discuss the foundation of robbing as a character and the abjection and loss of a name. I also want to discuss language, culture, and politics, or how language will shape the world that you live in, and just how important it is that we have a book talking about this. I also want to point out the critique that Rebecca does on the Global North education system, and specifically the scholarship system. And also, I want to know, where the fuck is all that silver coming from? Really. This is for 4 chapters. My God. If y'all were annoyed at the lectures in BABEL, I have terrible news for you. Anyway, let's begin. First, by taking off the dust jacket, because this annoys the fuck out of me. I hate dust jackets, and I don't understand why books in the US always have this, because it really annoys me. And we're gonna start with Robin. I saw a lot of people saying that Robin seemed like a one-dimensional character. A lot of people were saying that Robin was sort of like a mouthpiece to the author, that he was sort of a copy for everyone. And I think that the key to understand Robin, in my opinion, is in the first chapter of the book. Because if you won't get the first chapter and you won't get the significance of the first chapter, then you won't get just how violently Robin, the person that we know as Robin, was made, and the choices that he makes won't be as clear if you don't understand that foundation. So this is how I interpret it. The book starts with Robin dying next to his mom, and so he has spent days next to corpses and filth and decomposition and sickness and everything. He has spent days there, and he is a death's door himself. So he's saved by this very weird guy called Professor Lavelle. He is saved by him, then taken to England. So these are the first chapters of the book. But here's the thing. Here's one of the most interesting parts in the book for me. Because right as Professor Lavelle is talking to Robin when Robin came back to life, he says the following. "Very good," said Professor Lavelle. "One more thing. It occurs to me you need a name." "I have a name," said the boy. "No, that won't do. No Englishman can pronounce that. Did Miss Slade give you a name?" And then he says that she gave him the name of Robin. And then he picks the last name Swift because of Gulliver's Travels. And then Professor Lavelle says the following. To his surprise, Professor Lavelle laughed. "Very good. Robin Swift you will be. Mr. Swift, it's good to meet you." I think that this dialogue highlights one of the most important parts in what happened to Robin and what Robin is as a character. One of the things that I found most interesting about this whole exchange is that up until the moment that I am in the book, we never find Robin's Cantonese name. It's almost as if we only know Robin after he became Robin. And there is a lot of power in naming. There's a lot of power in holding the names and in holding on to your name. We're going to talk more about this in a second, because first I want to talk about the conditions that Robin was found. There was a condition of absolute abject horror, living amidst corpses and living amidst filth. And this is important. This is an interesting setup because it's not just like, oh, Robin gets almost killed, Robin is sick, he's living in filth, he's picked up by this English guy, he gets a new name. It's not that. It's the complete destruction of what a person was via this abject horror, and the construction of someone else via a new name. And so it's a two-moment process to the creation of Robin as a character. First, he's subjected to terrible abjection, and then he is given a new name. And so abjection is a concept that for me is very interesting, and I used it a lot in my thesis because it really highlights what can you do to a human to take them to the brink of their own existence, to be remade into something else? There's this author I really like. She's called Julia Kristeva, and she wrote a book called Powers of Horror. And in this book, she develops this idea of abjection within psychoanalysis. Now, I know people don't like psychoanalysis. People think psychoanalysis is dumb. We're just going to take psychoanalysis as a philosophical theory right here. I'm not talking about the merits of psychoanalysis as a form of therapy. I'm not talking about any of that. I just want to look at psychoanalysis as a philosophic tool for me right here, okay? She says that when we're forming ourselves, when we're becoming our own selves, there are parts of ourselves that we need to cast out in order to form our individuality. There are things about ourselves that are too dangerous to form what we come to know as ourselves, as our own personal beings. So she says that when we're born, we're not entirely aware that we're a different person than our mothers. We are just this amorphous mass of feelings and needs, and all of our feelings or needs are validated and they are immediately fulfilled. So you don't need to voice anything. You don't need to ask people anything. Your needs are immediately fulfilled when you're a child, or they're supposed to be, and this is why people are so traumatized when they are neglected as children. This awareness that you are your own person and you're different than your parents comes with time. And this is an awareness that in psychoanalysis, specifically Lacan says that this comes during the mirror stage, where when the baby looks at the mirror and realizes that one, that is a person, and two, that is who that person is. Like you look at the mirror and you go, oh, that's me. And so that is the mirror stage for Lacan. But what Kristeva says, she thinks that the mirror stage is important, but what she thinks is that we try to differentiate ourselves from our parents way before. And the way that we do this is via abjection. So abjection for her is not only a mental thing, it's a violent rejection of something. She gives the example in her book of the skin on top of the milk. When you boil the milk, there's the skin. She says that whenever she touches that, she immediately recoils. She feels disgusted, like the reaction. That is objection. I explained this in my thesis like this. Certain foods, smell, tastes, and textures will activate a certain irrational reaction from our biology that makes us recoil violently from the offending object. Certain animals and insects will provoke a virulent reaction that seems to come out of the deepest layers of our guts. We shrivel away, goosebumps raising the surface of our skin. This reaction, albeit involuntarily and seemingly innate to our biology, is nonetheless explained by Kristeva as pertaining to objection. It is important to clarify here that the skin of the milk or any other source of objection does not signify the space of rejection, but rather, and with every other thing that might elicit a violent reaction of disgust, shows us what we permanently thrust aside in order to live. Feces, excrements, maggots, certain textures and certain smells reminds us of the border of our own subjectivity, one that must violently be expelled if we are to remain living. So what this means basically is that there are things about ourselves that show us that our sense of individuality is not as sturdy as we might think. There are things about our lives that show us that we are very fragile as individual human beings. And so things that will cross the barriers of our body, things like feces, things like vomit, things like this, or certain types of food that are crossing into the barrier of the body. And it's even more so the case with corpses. Like the corpse shows us precisely the moment where that barrier of our individuality is crossed. This is why sometimes when we see a corpse, we're so scared by it, we're so horrified by it, we're so disgusted by it, because a corpse will remind us of this sort of frailty of our own sense of self that exists in our subconscious. So living in your own filth without being concerned with that barrier of your individuality really shows that your sense of self is shattered and has been shattered for a long time. As is living in a house with 3 corpses while you yourself is dying of cholera and you yourself is living amongst your own excrements and you yourself is sick. And so that shows that Robin was at the threshold of the final shattering of his identity. And when he's rescued from that, he has been living in that abject situation for so long that he really doesn't have much grip on who he was as a person anymore. So forcing Robin to live in abjection is central to his character. And I have a feeling that Lavelle has something to do with the circumstances that he came to be. But since I can't say anything right now, I will just say that forcing Robin to be in abjection right at the beginning is, for the author, an extremely interesting choice because it really fractures his sense of self, and it makes it so that it's easier for Lavelle to remake him into something else, to refashion him into something else that he needs. And this process is crowned when Robin picks a new name. Because listen, do y'all remember Spirited Away? Remember when in Spirited Away, Chihiro, she goes to Yubaba and Yubaba gives her a new name. She takes away one of the kanji from her name and says, "You are now Sen." And then Haku comes to Chihiro, gives her a piece of paper with her name and says, "You can't forget your name. Because if you forget your name, then that's how she controls you. You have to remember what your name is." And I think that the interesting thing here is that Robin didn't have a Haku. Like, he didn't have someone that could turn to him and say, "Hey, listen, your name is this, remember this." And so Robin starts losing grips and losing touch with who he was before the disease, before Lavelle. And he's remade to what Lavelle wants. And I think that this is why people have this idea that Robin is so... Oh, it's raining a lot. I think this is why people have this idea that Robin is so placid, and Robin really is almost like a mirror of everyone who comes to his side. He has no sense of identity. He's trying to grasp with this shattering of his identity because he has no sense of identity. No one said to him, "Your name is X. You are X from Canton who has this family," and etc., etc. He's forced to forget that. And I think that this is very incredible for us to understand Robin as a character. And this is why I don't necessarily agree with people who say that he is a flat character, that he's a mouthpiece, that he's one-dimensional, because he was created and fashioned in a way that was meant to be like that. And so I actually disagree, and I think that the creation of Robin as a character is actually very deep. And this ties very nicely with my second point, which is how language is central to everything, because I'm going to explain more theory here. I'm so sorry. Language is absolutely everything, and language will shape the ways in which we think and the ways in which society can exist. If there is something that is outside of language, aka the object, that's something, it's almost like that something didn't exist. It's not able to be comprehended because we comprehend stuff through language. And so in order to explain that, I have to explain this really interesting guy called Ferdinand de Saussure. Ferdinand de Saussure was born in 1857, so some ways after the history and the story of Babel is done. And his masterpiece, which is, I forgot the name now, but his masterpiece, like the work of most importance for him, was only published after his death in 1916. And so he is like almost 100 years beyond Babel in this discourse, but he creates a very revolutionary theory of language. As you can see in Babel, or at least until the part that I got in Babel, linguists up until that point were very concerned about the individual meaning and history of the world or word, with the individual etymology of the word. And so they analyze words almost like the silver blocks. Each word is its own block, and each word has its own history, and each word has its own thing going on for him and for it. And Saussure, he twists that upside down. Like if we take the word sun, right, and we trace the etymology of the word sun, we get Middle English sonne, then we get Old English sune, and then we have all the way back to Proto-Indo-European solwe, which also is the root for the word in Portuguese for sun, sol, which is why those two words are very similar. This is in and out of itself. I particularly think that this is interesting, and so does R.F. Kuang, because I hear that she talks a lot about this, but this in itself is interesting, but this is not in itself language. Because Saussure is going to say that language is just not the individual words that we use. Language is also the collection of contextual cultural cues and grammar and all types of stuff that, ooh, it's raining a lot. So Saussure is going to say that language is also a collection of the contextual clues that we use, of the grammar that we use, of the cultural context that we use. And this is the only reason why language is intelligible at all. We are extremely aware of these rules when they're not followed. But when we're speaking on our day-to-day basis, we are not aware of it. So we're governed by rules that we're not necessarily aware of. But we understand them as necessary for communication. Example, if I say, my neighbor has an orange cat, you understand what I mean. But if I say, for instance, and I note this down because it's very difficult to even say it, and has cat neighbor orange mine, you'll be like, what the fuck? Because that, I'm not using the specific background rules that will rule my speech, which is why when someone makes an awful translation, it sounds awkward when you don't adjust to certain cultural rules and expectations. And so this is why Saussure says that language is just not the individual words, they're important, but they're also this whole system of how we speak. So what he does is downright revolutionary. Language is not just the words, it's a system. And since it's a system, it's going to govern what we can say, because if we say things outside of the rules of the system, we're not going to be understood. And more importantly, the meaning of a word is developed over time in a specific culture and in specific cultural context. Sometimes the words have the same meaning, but they can in the same and different forms. Sometimes words can have the same form, but have different meanings. For instance, this is very easily seen with the case of false cognates. For instance, the word in Spanish for powder is polvo, and the word in Portuguese for octopus is polvo. And so you can see the words are written the same, and they don't mean the exact same thing because they come from different contexts and they are used in different cultural contexts. And so you will only know if I mean an octopus or if I mean dust or powder if you are given the contextual clues to which environment I'm speaking on. So when we're using a word, we're not just using a word, we're using the whole cultural context of that word. And so to learn a language is to learn a culture, which is why I speak English, people say so well, because I learned American culture. I didn't learn English. I learned American culture. And this is how I was able to gain fluency. And I thought that this was very interesting because it was very highlighted on Robin's experience with Chinese and English, because when he goes to England, he has to practice Chinese with Lavelle, and he realizes that his Chinese gets more and more stilted and less the way that he used to speak, while his English gets more and more natural because he's learning the culture of that place, but he's forgetting the culture of China where he was from. And so if he's forgetting that culture, he's sort of forgetting an important aspect of the language, which is the cultural and contextual clues in which they are used. If you're here raining, I'm not going to stop filming just for this. But, and I think that this is so important and this is so interesting, he never speaks Cantonese to Lavelle. And so he starts losing the Cantonese. And Lavelle is like, no, I want you to remember your Chinese. Your Chinese is important, but not your Cantonese. And so not only there is like a thing of which culture matters and what's the point of the culture that matters to me. It's the Chinese, not the Cantonese. But also, what's the language that is worth keeping? What is a language that is worth knowing? And I think that this is so interesting, and I'm going to talk about this in later videos, I think, because there's always a question here of what's the knowledge that is worth of keeping, what's the knowledge that is worth knowing, and what's knowledge that is not worth knowing, that can be forgotten, and the political choices behind that. But I'm not going to talk about this right this second. What I want to talk about is just how much this reminded me of indigenous children in residential schools in North America, because Robin was not forbidden to speak Cantonese to himself, but since there was no one he could speak to, it becomes difficult because language is something that needs someone else. You need someone else to speak to. Since he doesn't have anyone to speak to, he can't speak Cantonese with anyone. He starts losing this connection, which also signifies him losing his connection to his culture, to his mother tongue. I am reminded of that amazing song by Calle 13, where they sing, El que no quiere su patria, no quiere su madre. And so I feel like this is exactly it. He's forgetting his language, he's forgetting his culture, he's forgetting his country, he's forgetting his mom. And all of this comes together. Like, there are chapters where he doesn't even remember his mom, but he doesn't even remember where he came from. And I think that this is incredibly clever on Arthur's aspect to give more depth to the character and to highlight like what sort of knowledge is worth having and what sort of knowledge isn't. Because the only way that Robin will become what Lavelle wants is if Robin is devoid of all of his culture. He is going to be remade and reshaped into a tool of the Empire. And in order to do that, he can't have any sort of good feelings and harbor any love for the culture that he left behind. And so this is such a cruel violence that is done to him. And I think that it's so subtle and so beautifully done that I think that I like this better than the moments where the racism is more overstated. I think that the moments where the racism is overstated are important because those things do happen. And I think that people are not necessarily aware of just how racist the world can be to people of color. But at the same time, I like those more understated moments because I think and I feel like they highlight better just the depth and the level of violence that these people who are going to Babel in the same situation as Robin are going through. There is this book that I really love. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass, right? And there's this part. The chapter in question is chapter 2. And the beginning of the chapter, she says, to be native to a place, we must learn to speak its language, which I'm going to talk about this at a certain point, but today I want to talk about something else. So she's talking about not being fluent in the language of her people. She is indigenous, and that an elder teaches her the word babeee, which is the force that a mushroom will exert on the dirt in order to sprout overnight. And she's talking about trying to reconnect with the language and attending a lecture on reconnecting with her language. And she says this: A man with long gray braids tells how his mother hid him away when the Indian agents came to take the children. He escaped boarding school by hiding under an overhung bank when the sound of the stream covered his crying. The others were all taken and had their mouths washed with soap or worse for talking that dirty Indian language. Because he alone stayed home and was raised up calling the plants and animals by the name the Creator gave them, he's here today, a carrier of the language. The engines of assimilation worked well. The speaker's eyes blaze as he tells us, "We are at the end of the road. We are all that is left. If you young people do not learn, the language will die. The missionaries and the U.S. government will have their victory at last." A great-grandmother from the circle pushes her walker up to the microphone. "It's not just the words that will be lost," she says. "The culture is the heart of our culture. It holds our thoughts, our way of seeing the world. It's too beautiful for English to explain. Babeee." And I think that this is, there's just a lot to be said here, again, on what knowledge is valid and what isn't. But I think that this highlights precisely the level of violence that Robin is being subjected to. He's being shut off from his main way of connecting with his language, which is Cantonese. And I think that this is so beautifully done in this book. I am absolutely in love with how subtle this is and just how understated and just how brilliant that this movement is made. I'm going to talk about epistemology and what knowledge is considered valid and what isn't, but I want to read a little bit more and get to the actual lectures before I talk anything about it. But what I want to talk about, there's two more things that I want to discuss. And the first one is the critique that R.F. Kuang does on the American, the global North, really, education system. This particular critique is on page 87, if I'm not mistaken, where she says the following. One thing united them all. Without Babel, they had nowhere in this country to go. They'd been chosen for privileges they couldn't have ever imagined, funded by powerful and wealthy men whose motives they did not fully understand, and they were acutely aware that these could be lost at any moment. The precariousness made them simultaneously bold and terrified. They had the keys to the kingdom. They did not want to give them back. And I think that this is so interesting because isn't this just what being on a scholarship is? You're being funded by people you don't know for reasons you don't know. And you're producing this knowledge hoping that this is enough because it took you away from a place where you don't want to go back to. I think that this is so interesting. And I keep thinking that if I had gone abroad, this was going to be my situation. I was going to stay in a place where I don't necessarily think I'm welcome, but it's better than the place where I left. Working, trying to see if this knowledge that I'm giving them for free, actually I'm paying them to give them this knowledge that I have, will be of use to this empire. And this is so interesting because it's so different from how education is done here in Brazil. Education in Brazil, we say that we are structured on a triad. So it's teaching, research, and extension. So teaching is classroom, research is your own personal research, and extension is when you get what you learn both in the classroom and in your personal research, and you apply it for the community, which is why I have projects for LGBTQ plus right issue. I've done many other projects for less deserving communities because the idea is the knowledge that we produce here is a knowledge that is going to be produced for the community first and foremost, and not necessarily for individual for individual wants and needs of random people. So I think particularly that this was a very interesting critique, and I'm very happy to see that R.F. Kuang was not blind to that. The critique on the educational system also made me realize that I'm actually kind of impressed with how universities in the global south work, because it's almost as if we get this knowledge that is built for some people only in the global north, and we adapt it in a way that makes it available for everyone. And so I think I'm going to finish this book being even more in favor that all superior education in Brazil be public and free, as it is the majority of it. I'm not sure if you guys know, I went to a public university in Brazil, and my amount of tuition that I owed was zero. I paid nothing, but I did give a lot back to the community, and I did a lot of very interesting things. So yeah, I really liked how she voiced this critique. But I have a critique of my own, actually, because here's the thing. Up until the 1800s, 85% of all silver that was traded in the world came from Latin America. There is specifically this one place in Bolivia called Potosi, And Eduardo Galeano talks about it in The Open Veins of Latin America, and he says the following: Potosian society, seek with ostentation and extravagance, left Bolivia with only a vague memory of its splendors, of the ruins of its churches and palaces, and of 8 million Indian corpses. Any one of the diamonds encrusted in a rich caballero's shield was worth more than what an Indian could earn in his whole life under the mitayo. A mitayo is an Indian who pays a mita, or tribute, usually in the form of forced labor in public works, especially mines. But the caballero took off with the diamonds. If it were not a futile exercise, Bolivia, now one of the world's most poverty-stricken countries, could boast of having nourished the wealth of the wealthiest. In our time, Potosi is a poor city in a poor Bolivia, the city which has given most to the world and has the least. And as an old Potosian lady, enveloped in a mile of alpaca shawl, told me when we talked on the Andalusian patio of her 2-century-old house, condemned to nostalgia, tortured by poverty and cold, Potosi remains an open wound of the colonial system in America, a still audible j'accuse. And the English translation, for some reason, cuts this off, but in the actual edition, my Portuguese edition, and the original edition, it ends with, the world would have to start by apologizing to it. Why am I talking about this? Because there's a lot of talk about silver working and what silver working is, but there's not a lot of concern with explaining where the silver for silver working comes from. And I think that this might be significant of a way of doing decolonial critique that is very particular for the global north, because it's important. This silver that is going there to do silver working is already in itself a product of colonization. So the silver is not getting there to a blank state. And understand why silver is an important thing, because in the original Opium War that actually happened, China would demand to be paid only in silver, so they wouldn't trade goods. It's interesting that silver was chosen for this reason, but also the silver that was being given to China came from a place. And that place where the majority of it was Latin America. If you read Mexican Gothic, you know exactly what I'm talking about, that this silver also left deep, abiding wounds in Latin America. And I would really love to see that represented in BABEL. And so I haven't read the rest yet, but I do think that worrying about where the silver came from and worrying about the difficulties of this silver is a question that needs to be answered by R.F. Kuang. And if it isn't, it's going to be a huge miss for me, because I feel like this is also an important part of this whole process. The silver that was sent up was also an important part of this whole process. And so I think that I'm going to leave this for my other moments. But if this is not addressed, then I think that this is very representative of how the global north sees decolonization. But especially the old world, I would say, sees decolonization, and how often the Americas are left out of it, mostly because people associate the Americas with the United States without understanding the history of exploitation that has happened here before, that has nothing to do with the United States, and from which the United States actually benefited from. So yeah, for now, this is my only gripe. I'm very interested to see if the silver, where is the silver coming from, is going to be addressed. So these were my thoughts so far. I think the characterization of Robin is brilliant. I think it has a lot of depth to it and explains a lot of the trauma that came with the creation of Robin as a character. I think that R.F. Kuang is very clear about how deeply important language is and just how systematically it can erase whole slots of cultures if it's not remembered. I think there's a lot to be discussed on how important language is to both to domination and to resistance. And I think that Robin's trajectory of forgetting where he comes from is one that many immigrant people will actually resonate with. I think that the critique on the scholarship system is great, but I'm very concerned if R.F. Kuang is going to just not ask herself, where is all this silver coming from, and not make a critique on that. So I'm thinking about it because it hasn't been explained yet. So yeah, these are my thoughts so far. For the next video, I'm reading book 2, which spans from page 93, chapter 5, to page 219, which is chapter 12. So if you want to read or reread along with me, that's your reading assignment. Just kidding, y'all are my students. I'm not sure my students even like me that much, but anyway, this was today's video. Again, if you're interested in all of the references that I used in this review, let me put the dust jacket back on. If you're interested in the references that I have used, and to have access to my digital library where I can actually put the files for those readings. My Patreon is available in the description below. If you found that this video was helpful, you can always buy me a coffee on Ko-fi. The link is also in the description below. And I'll see you in about 2 or 3 weeks time with another video of my impressions of the book 2 of Babel. So yeah, this was today's video, and I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!